Okay, Judy, thank you for your patience. We are going live on YouTube. If you could just give me a thumbs up in the chat, just so I know that you can hear me because I have a problem with hearing. Okay. Okay, terrific. Okay, I want to tackle a somewhat obscure mitzvah in this parsha, especially for us today, which is the mitzvah of kisui adam. Simply speaking, there's a mitzvah that when one slaughters a bird or a chaya or a non-domesticated animal, again, we don't eat a lot of non-domesticated animals today, but deer, gazelles, theoretically giraffes, all kinds of animals like that are kosher animals, aren't domesticated, live in the wild. The mitzvah is that upon slaughtering the animal, that the blood needs to be covered up. And it is striking that if we're trying to understand the symbolism of this mitzvah, one of the things that we need to account for is what is the difference between this and a behemoth, right? An animal which is offered as a sacrifice, right? So in other words, it's we really have, if we want to come up with a cogent explanation or understanding of what this mitzvah is about, we need to, number one, explain what's the idea in general, and number two, why is it specific to these animals? So one line of explanation that we find, particularly in the Rishonim, and which is actually very consistent with the Psukim, is that this has something to do with the world of Avodah Zarah, the world of idolatry, right? And again, if one looks contextually, that the Psukim where this mitzvah is found talks about the obligation that regular sacrifices should be brought to the Mishkan, and later to the Beis Hamikdash, right? And that the Jewish people should not be giving sacrifices out in the fields. That the Torah talks about something called seirim. Literally, seirim normally means goats, right? This seems to mean some kind of demon or goat-headed deity of some sort that ancient idolaters believed lived out in the wilds, and that sacrifices of protection were made to these kinds of deities. So the Ibn Ezra suggests that what really is going on here is a form of a concern of marasayin. In other words, we don't want it to look, if you are out in the fields, and this is one of the things which is significant, right? The way that the Torah presents it, even though, again, halachically, it applies to any bird or any wild animal, wherever it is. In other words, if you raise you trap a deer, right, and it grows up in your backyard, then you take the deer to a slaughterhouse, right? The fact that it's being slaughtered in a domestic setting, very much like a cow, right, there's still a mitzvah of kisui hadam that applies to it. This is a particularly important thing to us when it comes to birds, right? We're used to think about birds as very domesticated kinds of animals, right? Chickens and the like. The truth is there are many kinds of wild birds that are kosher. Again, today we don't, for a variety of reasons, we tend not to eat these wild birds. In fact, we've even lost the tradition for some of them. But going back not so long ago, there's a book published in Italy with pictures in the 18th century that had dozens of different kinds of birds that are kosher birds, right? So that, again, as opposed to mammals, right, where we classify as domestic or wild, birds, even though in our experience birds are domestic, really there were many kind of kosher birds that existed, many of them wild, and therefore, as a category, these things were wild. So Ibn Ezra says like this, that for the kinds of animals that tend to be caught and then slaughtered in the wild, right, that there's the concern that act looks like this goat worship, right? And there's this avodas haseirim, which is referenced in the parsha, and the Torah says not only are you not allowed to do it, you can't even give the impression that that's what you're doing. So in order to stop that possibility, right, that the sprinkling of dirt over the blood was to be an indication that the blood had no religious aspect at all, right? The Ramban seems to feel that it's not just a question of Marasayim, but that this is really a reminder, right? That this was something. It was a real temptation. Yeah, you have to remember also that particularly in ancient times, right, the idea that the wilds were a place that were very frightening, right, very scary, right? The idea that people really believed in all kinds of spirits of different sorts, right? And the idea that a person might want to hedge their bets, right, and offer such a offering of sorts for protection. So the mitzvah of kisui adam, right, the fact that a reminder, right, that is not part of our tradition, that instead that blood has to be treated as we're just going to dump some dirt on it and move on, that it cannot be used in a sacred way at all. And so again, within these approaches, the idea that whether the appearance of avodah zarah or the even temptation of avodah zarah are stronger in the beasts of the wild, right, perhaps that is significant as well. The Kleyakar understands this differently. It says that this is all a subset of the general prohibition on the consumption of blood, right? And as we know that we're not allowed to eat blood, and that we go to great extents to prevent that. And he suggests that perhaps someone might have thought, right, in other words, that these kinds of birds and wild animals really are treats, right? In other words, it would only be acquired there, to this day, right? Venison is not something which is, from a kosher perspective, is widely available, right? And one might think that when if someone put great effort into obtaining, a deer, a gazelle, a wild pheasant, whatever it is, right? That the temptation of using, again, to mix a metaphor, every part of the buffalo would be much stronger, right? As opposed to when you shecht a more conventional kind of animal, right? Where by part of the standard operating procedure is that you would drain the blood as required by halacha, that someone might be tempted to say, you know what, like this is all like, I spent so much effort on this, right? This one is all for me, right? Including the dam. So by specifically having an obligation attached to the blood of such animals, the Kleyakar says that would be a guard against that. Finally, a very interesting idea by Rav Kook. Rav Kook was someone who, the question of exactly, he certainly flirted with the notion of vegetarianism. It seems that he was not in practice actually a vegetarian, but he very much saw vegetarianism as a messianic ideal, right? And the question of a certain kind of relationship with the animal kingdom. So he suggested that the notion of kisui adam, of covering the blood, right, which almost has it's almost like a notion of burial of sorts, is perhaps out of a debt owed to these animals which are typically wild, right? That a domesticated animal, right, the fact that we, feed them, take care of them, raise them, right, all in order that we be able to have the possibility to have them available as food, right, creates a certain kind of dynamic that perhaps for a wild animal, right, that we kind of intrude into its sphere to be able to take it for ourselves, that there is a certain debt that is owed to us in order to acknowledge that. The idea of kisui adam, the idea of not taking the blood of these kinds of animals for granted, right? We've done nothing for the animal other than kill it, right? That we are required to give it, as it were, its last kind of a last respect as far as that's concerned. So again, three different ideas when it comes to the mitzvah of kisui adam, right? One is the idea that somehow it's connected to the idea that these kinds of wild animals and wild spaces were connected to a specific kind of avodah zarah, connected to the blood, that the Ibn Ezra and the Ramban in slightly different ways developed this idea that blood therefore has to be disposed of in such a way as to rule out any possibility that's being done for cultic kind of purposes. The approach of the Kleyakar says that these are things that were delicacies that would be coveted by people, and therefore perhaps the regular halachic restrictions on eating blood, someone might consider ignoring those, right, by adding an extra layer of mitzvah that must be done, right, will help preserve that prohibition. Finally, the approach of Rav Kook, that this is a gesture towards an animal whose life we've taken, but have done nothing for its good, unlike a behemoth, unlike a domestic animal, where there was that pre-existent dynamic, that pre-existent relationship beforehand. Finally, there's a fascinating medrash in Bereshis Rabbah that suggests that it was the birds of the field that when Hevel was killed, that the animals, the birds came to bury him, and perhaps as a tribute to that, that we continue to give them that honor of Kisui Adam in memory of that midrashic tradition. A good Shabbos to all.
Thank you. Good Shabbos.